The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the dusty trail, and Eleanor Whitmore gripped the worn leather seat with white knuckles. Through the grimy window, she watched the endless expanse of Texas plains roll by under a merciless summer sun. Her wedding dress, carefully wrapped in tissue paper and stored in the trunk above, would be wrinkled beyond repair by the time they reached their destination. Not that it mattered much now. She was traveling to marry a man she'd never met, answering an advertisement that promised a comfortable life on a prosperous ranch. The letter from Samuel Hartwell had been formal but kind, describing his spread outside the town of Cedar Creek and his need for a wife to help manage his household. Eleanor, desperate to escape the suffocating poverty of her aunt's Boston boarding house after her parents' death, had responded with hope blooming in her chest for the first time in months. Now as the coach swayed and creaked through the heat, that hope felt as fragile as spider silk. Cedar Creek next stop, hollered the driver, and Eleanor's stomach clenched. She smoothed her dark blue traveling dress and adjusted her bonnet, trying to present herself as the capable, refined woman she'd claimed to be in her letters. The truth was, she'd never managed anything larger than her aunt's tiny kitchen, and her idea of ranch life came entirely from dime novels. The town of Cedar Creek was smaller than she'd imagined, just a dusty main street lined with weathered buildings and hitching posts. The stagecoach pulled up in front of the general store, and Eleanor gathered her carpet bag and reticule, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd expected Mr. Hartwell to meet her, but the only person waiting was a grizzled man in a battered hat who introduced himself as Jake Morrison. "You Miss Whitmore?" he asked, touching the brim of his hat. "Sam Hartwell sent me to fetch you. Had to stay back at the ranch. Some trouble with rustlers." He hefted her trunk as if it weighed nothing and loaded it into a wagon that had seen better days. "Hope you don't mind the ride out. It's a fair piece." Eleanor climbed onto the wagon seat, trying to hide her disappointment. She'd hoped to make a good first impression, and arriving covered in trail dust hadn't been part of her plan. Jake Morrison seemed kind enough, though, and he kept up a steady stream of conversation about the weather and the cattle market as they bounced along the rutted road leading away from town. "There's the Hartwell place," Jake said after what felt like hours, pointing to a cluster of buildings in the distance. But as they drew closer, Eleanor's heart began to sink. The main house was smaller than she'd expected, and several of the outbuildings looked in need of repair. This didn't look like the prosperous spread Samuel Hartwell had described in his letters. Jake seemed to notice her expression. "Times have been hard," he said quietly. "Sam's been struggling since his wife died. That's why he advertised for help." He paused, then added, "You seem like a good woman, Miss Whitmore. I hope you'll give him a chance." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Eleanor climbed down on shaking legs. The front door opened, and a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair stepped onto the porch. His clothes were clean but patched, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of old sorrows. This had to be Samuel Hartwell. But before he could speak, a small figure burst from behind him, a girl of perhaps 6 years old with tangled brown hair and a dress that had seen better days. She looked up at Eleanor with wide, eager eyes and said, "We were waiting for you." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Samuel Hartwell had never mentioned a daughter in his letters. The little girl smiled shyly and added, "Papa said you were coming to be our new mama." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor looked from the child to the man, confusion and something like panic rising in her chest. Samuel Hartwell's face had gone pale, and he was staring at her as if seeing a ghost. Finally, Jake Morrison cleared his throat. "Sam," he said carefully, "this here's Miss Eleanor Whitmore, the lady who answered your advertisement." Samuel Hartwell blinked several times, then shook his head slowly. "I think there's been a mistake," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I never placed any advertisement. I never wrote to any lady about marriage." He looked at Eleanor with genuine regret. "I'm sorry, miss, but I think you've been brought to the wrong place." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She pulled the carefully folded letter from her reticule with trembling hands. "But this is your name," she said weakly. "Samuel Hartwell, Cedar Creek, Texas." Jake Morrison took the letter and studied it, his brow furrowed. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Sam, this here letter's got your name on it, but look at the return address." He pointed to the top of the page. "This came from the Triple Bar Ranch, about 15 miles south of here. That'd be Samuel Hartford's spread." "Hartford," Eleanor whispered. feeling as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Not Hartwell. The little girl, who had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, suddenly grabbed Eleanor's skirt. "But we were waiting for you," she repeated, her voice small and desperate. "Papa's been so sad since Mama went to heaven. I wished every night for someone to come and be our new Mama, and now you're here." Eleanor knelt down to the child's level, her heart breaking at the hope shining in those young eyes. "What's your name, Sweart?" she asked gently. "Lucy," the girl whispered. "Lucy Hartwell. Are you really not going to be my Mama?" Before Eleanor could answer, Samuel Hartwell stepped forward, his face etched with pain. "Lucy, honey, we talked about this. Mama's not coming back, and we can't just wish for a new one to appear." He looked at Eleanor with deep apology. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. My daughter has been hopeful since her mother passed last year. This must be very difficult for you." Eleanor stood slowly, her mind reeling. She was stranded at the wrong ranch, with no money for passage back to Boston, and nowhere to go even if she could afford it. The man she was supposed to marry was 15 miles away, probably wondering where his intended bride had gotten to. But looking at Lucy's tear-stained face and Samuel's exhausted eyes, she felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, "how long would it take to get to the Triple Bar Ranch?" Jake scratched his chin. "Well, it's getting late now. Sun'll be down soon. Wouldn't be safe to travel that road in the dark, what with all the rustler trouble we've been having. First light tomorrow, I reckon." Eleanor nodded, trying to think clearly. She had little choice but to accept Samuel Hartwell's hospitality for the night, awkward as it would be. "I don't suppose you have room for an unexpected guest?" she asked. Samuel's face softened slightly. "Of course. Lucy can sleep with me, and you can have her room. It's not much, but it's clean." He paused, then added, "I'll cook something for supper. It's the least I can do." As the sun began to set, Eleanor found herself sitting at a simple wooden table in the Hartwell kitchen, watching Samuel prepare a meal of beans and cornbread while Lucy chattered beside her. The little girl had attached herself to Eleanor's side, peppering her with questions about Boston and what it was like to live in a big city. "Did you really live in a house with stairs inside?" Lucy asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "Did?" Eleanor said, smiling despite her circumstances. 3 whole floors, with a room just for keeping books." "We don't have any books except Papa's Bible and Mama's cookbook," Lucy said wistfully. "Mama used to read to me from her cookbook sometimes, when she was making special things. She made the best apple pie in 3 counties. Samuel's movements at the stove grew very still, and Eleanor saw his shoulders tense at the mention of his wife. She reached out and gently touched Lucy's hand. "I'm sure she did. What else did your mama like to do?" For the next hour, Lucy regaled Eleanor with stories about her mother, Sarah, who had been beautiful and kind and had sung lullabies every night. Samuel listened in silence, occasionally adding a soft comment or correction, and Eleanor began to understand the depth of grief that hung over this little household like a shroud. After supper, Eleanor insisted on helping with the dishes despite Samuel's protests. As they worked side by side at the wash basin, she found herself studying his profile in the lamplight. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably not much older than her own 23 years. The gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes spoke of hardship rather than age. "I'm sorry about the confusion," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "I can't imagine what this must be like for you, coming all this way only to find out it was all a mistake." Eleanor dried a plate carefully before answering. "It wasn't your mistake to make," she said. "And to be honest, I'm not sure what I was expecting. Marrying a stranger seemed like the only option I had left, but that doesn't mean it was a good one." Samuel glanced at her then, surprise flickering across his features. "You have doubts about marrying Mr. Hartford?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, listening to Lucy's soft humming as the little girl played with a corn-husk doll by the fireplace. "I have doubts about everything," she admitted. "I've never lived on a ranch. I don't know the first thing about cattle or chickens or any of it. I answered that advertisement because I was desperate, not because I was suited for the life." "What kind of life are you suited for?" Samuel asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I don't know," she said finally. "I thought I knew, back in Boston. I thought I'd marry a banker or a merchant, keep house in the city, maybe have children who would go to good schools and have opportunities I never had. But my parents died, and there wasn't any money, and suddenly all those dreams seemed as far away as the moon. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, and when Lucy began to yawn, Eleanor offered to help get her ready for bed. The little girl's room was tiny but neat, with a patchwork quilt on the narrow bed and a few simple toys arranged on a wooden shelf. As Eleanor helped Lucy into her nightgown, she noticed that the child's clothes, while clean, were all carefully mended. "Miss Eleanor," Lucy said as Eleanor tucked her into bed, "do you think it was a mistake, sending you to the wrong place?" The question caught Eleanor off guard, and she sat on the edge of the bed to think about it. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes things that seem like mistakes turn out to be exactly what we needed." Lucy's eyes grew heavy, but she fought against sleep. "Papa says Mama's watching over us from heaven. Do you think she sent you here?" Eleanor's throat tightened unexpectedly. "What do you think?" "I think maybe she did," Lucy whispered. "Papa's been so sad and our house doesn't laugh anymore. But you made him almost smile at supper, and that hasn't happened in a long, long time." Long after Lucy had fallen asleep, Eleanor sat in the kitchen with Samuel, sharing a pot of coffee and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Coyotes howled in the distance, and somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered softly. "She's a wonderful little girl," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence. Samuel's face softened as it always did when speaking of his daughter. "She's the best thing Sarah and I ever made together. Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn." He paused, staring into his coffee cup. "I worry about her, though. She needs things I can't give her. A woman's guidance, proper schooling, nice dresses. All I know is cattle and horses. You know how to love her," Eleanor pointed out. "That's more important than nice dresses." Samuel looked up at her then, and she saw something shift in his expression. "You'd make a good mother," he said quietly. "The way you listened to her tonight, the way you tucked her in. Sarah would have liked you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, but before she could respond, Samuel pushed back from the table abruptly. "I should check on the stock," he said, his voice suddenly formal. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will come early." Eleanor watched him go, her mind churning with confused emotions. She'd come here to marry a stranger, and instead, she'd found something she hadn't expected, a family that needed her, and a man whose quiet strength and gentle devotion to his daughter touched something deep in her heart. She lay awake most of the night in Lucy's narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to sort through her feelings. By morning, she'd come to a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Samuel was already up when she emerged from Lucy's room, coffee brewing on the stove and the smell of frying bacon filling the kitchen. Lucy sat at the table, fully dressed and bouncing with nervous energy. "Papa says Mr. Jake is coming to take you to the right place after breakfast," Lucy said, her voice carefully neutral in the way children used when trying not to show their feelings. Eleanor sat beside her and accepted the cup of coffee Samuel offered. "Lucy, what if I didn't want to go to the right place? What if I thought this was the right place after all?" The little girl's eyes widened, and Samuel's hand stilled as he was turning the bacon. "What do you mean?" Lucy whispered. Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything. "I mean, what if I stayed here instead? What if, instead of marrying a man I've never met, I stayed and helped your papa with the ranch and maybe learned how to be the kind of mother you deserve?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Lucy's face was a mixture of hope and disbelief, while Samuel had gone very still, his back to them both. Finally, he turned around, and Eleanor saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "you don't know what you're saying. This is a hard life, and we don't have much to offer. The ranch is struggling, money's tight, and there's no guarantee things will get better." Eleanor stood and walked to him, her heart hammering but her resolve firm. "Mr. Hartwell, I came west looking for a new life, even if it meant marrying a stranger. Last night, I realized something important. I'd rather build a life with people I care about, even if it's hard, than live comfortably with someone I don't love." "But you don't know us," Samuel protested, though his voice was soft. "You've been here one day." Eleanor reached out and gently took his hand. It was rough and calloused from years of hard work, but warm and steady. "I know that you love your daughter more than your own life. I know that you work from dawn to dusk to give her the best you can. I know that you're still grieving the woman you loved, and I'm not trying to replace her. But I also know that Lucy is right, you need help, and maybe I need to be needed." Before Samuel could respond, Lucy launched herself from her chair and wrapped her arms around both of them. "Does this mean you'll really stay?" she asked, her voice muffled against Eleanor's skirt. "Does this mean you'll really be my mama?" Eleanor looked at Samuel over Lucy's head, seeing the war of hope and fear in his expression. "Only if your papa thinks it's a good idea," she said softly. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor held her breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah used to say that life has a strange way of surprising us. I never thought I'd marry again, never thought I'd want to. But if you're willing to take on a struggling ranch and a grieving widower, and a little girl who talks too much and has dirt under her fingernails more often than not, I'm willing," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm more than willing." The next few months passed in a blur of hard work and small joys. Eleanor threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life, from tending the chickens to helping with the bookkeeping. Samuel taught her to ride, his patience infinite as she learned to stay in the saddle. Lucy appointed herself Eleanor's guide to everything important about their new life together, from the best places to find wildflowers to the names of all the horses. True to Samuel's warning, it was a hard life. The ranch struggled financially, and there were days when Eleanor wondered if they'd make it through another winter. But there were also moments of pure happiness. Lucy's laughter echoing through the house, Samuel's rare but devastating smiles, evenings spent around the kitchen table playing simple games or listening to Eleanor read from the few books she'd brought from Boston. Gradually, the grief that had settled over the Hartwell household began to lift, replaced by something warmer and more hopeful. Samuel never spoke directly about his feelings, but Eleanor saw them in the way he watched her with Lucy, in the way he made sure she had the warmest coat when winter came, in the small kindnesses he showed her every day. The proposal, when it finally came, was as practical and unromantic as everything else about their relationship had been. They were sitting on the front porch after Lucy had gone to bed, watching the stars come out over the prairie, when Samuel cleared his throat. "Eleanor," he said, and the use of her first name made her look at him in surprise. In all the months she'd been there, he'd still called her Miss Whitmore. "I've been thinking. About us, about the future." Eleanor's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "What about it?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You've been here almost 6 months now, and I can't imagine this place without you anymore. Lucy adores you, and you've worked harder than any woman should have to. But people in town are starting to talk, and I worry about your reputation." Eleanor almost smiled at his old-fashioned concern. "Are you asking me to marry you to preserve my reputation?" Samuel Hartwell. He looked at her then, and in the starlight, she saw something she'd been hoping to see for months. "I'm asking you to marry me because I love you," he said simply. "I know it's not the romantic courtship you probably dreamed of, and I know I'm not much of a catch. But you've brought life back to this house, and joy back to my daughter, and something I didn't think I'd ever feel again back to my heart." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of happiness. "Yes," she said, reaching for his hand. "Yes, of course, yes." Their wedding was simple, held in the little church in Cedar Creek with Jake Morrison as witness and Lucy as an excited flower girl. Eleanor wore her blue traveling dress, the wedding gown she'd brought from Boston having been quietly donated to a young woman in town who needed it more. As they exchanged vows, she thought about the letter that had brought her here, about the twist of fate that had led her to the wrong ranch at exactly the right time. That night, as they sat around their kitchen table, their table now, truly Lucy asked the question that had been on her mind all day. "Mama Eleanor," she said, using the name that had gradually replaced Miss Eleanor over the months, "do you ever wish you'd gone to the right ranch that first day?" Eleanor looked at Samuel, who was watching her with love and gratitude shining in his eyes, and then at Lucy, whose face was bright with happiness and security. She thought about Samuel Hartford, the man she was supposed to marry, and wondered briefly what her life might have been like if Jake Morrison had read that letter correctly. "No, sweetheart," she said, pulling Lucy into her lap. "I think sometimes the wrong place turns out to be exactly where you belong." Outside, the wind swept across the Texas plains, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. Inside the little ranch house, 3 people who had found each other against all odds settled in for the evening, bound together by love that had grown not from passion or convenience, but from the simple, daily choice to care for one another. Eleanor had come west as a mail-order bride to a man she'd never met, seeking escape from a life that offered no future. Instead, she'd found something far more precious, a family that needed her as much as she needed them, a love built on respect and shared struggles, and a home where laughter had returned after too long an absence. Years later, when Lucy was grown and had children of her own, she would still tell the story of the day her new mother arrived at the wrong ranch, but stayed anyway because a little girl had said, "We were waiting for you." And Eleanor, gray-haired and content, would smile and add that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as mistakes, and that love had a way of finding you exactly where you needed to be. The ranch prospered under their joint care, not because they became wealthy, but because they became a family. Samuel's quiet strength combined with Eleanor's determination created something neither could have achieved alone. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated good harvests and the birth of 2 more children, and built a legacy that would endure for generations. Eleanor often thought about that terrifying moment when Jake Morrison had announced there'd been a mistake, when she'd realized she was at the wrong ranch with nowhere to go. She'd felt like her world was ending, but it had actually been beginning. The fear she'd felt that day had been the last time she'd ever felt truly alone. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Eleanor and Samuel would sit on their front porch and watch the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked about their plans for the ranch, sometimes about the children's futures, and sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together. The letter that had started it all, the one addressed to Samuel Hartford instead of Samuel Hartwell, remained tucked away in Eleanor's bureau drawer. She kept it not as a reminder of what might have been, but as a testament to how the smallest details could change the course of a life. One letter, one name, one moment of human error had led to a love story more beautiful than any she could have imagined. Lucy, now a confident young woman preparing for her own wedding, had asked her mother once if she ever wondered about the man she was supposed to marry, about Samuel Hartford and the life that might have been. Eleanor had considered the question seriously before, answering that some paths were meant to be taken, and others were meant to be missed so that we could find our way to where we truly belonged. The Triple Bar Ranch, where Eleanor was originally supposed to go, had thrived under Samuel Hartford's management. She'd met him once at a cattle auction years later, a pleasant man with kind eyes and a wife he'd found through more conventional means. They'd spoken briefly, and Eleanor had felt nothing more than mild curiosity about the path not taken. Her heart belonged entirely to the family she'd built with Samuel Hartwell, to the love that had grown from necessity and blossomed into something extraordinary. On quiet Sunday mornings, when the family gathered in their small parlor for Eleanor's reading from the few precious books they owned, she was reminded of how different her life had become from her original dreams. She'd once imagined herself in a grand Boston home, surrounded by fine things and social obligations. Instead, she found herself in a modest ranch house, surrounded by love and purpose, and she knew with absolute certainty which life was richer. The cattle business had its ups and downs, but the Hartwell family endured. They learned to read the signs of changing weather, to prepare for lean times and celebrate abundant ones. Eleanor mastered skills she'd never imagined needing: preserving meat, treating sick animals, teaching children from books worn soft with use. Samuel learned to trust again, to share his burdens and his joys, to believe that happiness could come more than once in a lifetime. Their love story wasn't written in grand gestures or passionate declarations. It was written in shared morning coffee before dawn, in working side by side under the blazing Texas sun, in quiet conversations after difficult days. It was written in Eleanor's patient teaching as Lucy learned to read, in Samuel's gentle guidance as Eleanor learned to handle horses, in the laughter of their children playing in the dusty yard. The neighboring ranchers, who had initially been skeptical of the Boston woman who'd arrived at the wrong place and decided to stay, came to respect Eleanor's determination and practical wisdom. She became known for her skill with sick animals and her willingness to help other families in times of need. Samuel's reputation grew as well, not just as a capable rancher, but as a man who'd found happiness again and wasn't afraid to show it. As the years passed and their hair grew gray, Eleanor and Samuel would sometimes talk about that first night when she'd slept in Lucy's small bed, neither of them able to sleep for different reasons. They'd been strangers then, thrown together by circumstances neither had planned. Now they moved through their days with the easy rhythm of long partnership, each knowing the other's thoughts before they were spoken. The stagecoach still ran through Cedar Creek, bringing new arrivals seeking fresh starts and second chances. Sometimes Eleanor would see young women stepping down with the same mixture of hope and terror she'd felt that day so long ago. And she would remember the weight of carrying everything you owned in a single trunk, the fear of discovering that your carefully laid plans meant nothing. She made it a point to welcome newcomers when she could, to offer them the kindness she'd received from unexpected sources. The general store where she'd first arrived became a place where she was known and respected, where her advice was sought by other women facing the challenges of frontier life. The cemetery outside Cedar Creek held Sarah Hartwell's grave, tended carefully by her family and marked with wildflowers that Lucy still brought every spring. Eleanor had worried, in those early days, about living in the shadow of a beloved first wife. But Samuel had helped her understand that love didn't diminish when shared, that honoring Sarah's memory was part of what made their own love possible. In the end, Eleanor's story became part of the folklore of Cedar Creek, told and retold with different details but always the same heart, the tale of the bride who came to the wrong place and found the right life. Children grew up hearing about the mix-up that led to true love, about the little girl who said, "We were waiting for you," and meant it with all her heart. The ranch itself stood as testament to their love, not grand or imposing, but solid and enduring. The house had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, but the original kitchen table remained, scarred and worn but still the heart of their home. It was there that Eleanor had first felt the possibility of belonging, there that Lucy had claimed her as family, there that Samuel had spoken his first words of love. And on winter evenings, when the wind howled across the plains and snow piled against the windows, Eleanor would look around at her family gathered in the warmth of their home and remember the desperate young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but hope and determination. That woman could never have imagined the richness of the life that waited for her at the wrong ranch, couldn't have dreamed that a mistake in delivery would deliver her to exactly where she belonged. The last entry Eleanor made in her diary, written in shaking handwriting near the end of her long and happy life, was simple. "Today I counted my blessings again, as I do every day. A loving husband, wonderful children, a life of purpose and meaning, and it all began with going to the wrong place at exactly the right time." Life's mysteries are strange, and sometimes even a simple mix-up in the mail can change everything. Samuel found the diary after Eleanor's peaceful passing and read those words through tears of gratitude for the woman who had transformed his broken life into something beautiful. The wrong ranch had been the right place after all, and love had found a way to bloom in the harsh beauty of the Texas plains, lasting long beyond the lives of those who had planted it there.